Good morning. Welcome to the environmental training. My name is Jill Seed, and I am the manager of the environmental team here at the GLO. And we're hoping that this training is really interactive and beneficial to everybody. We have a wide variety of people with different skill levels here, which is great to see. I think we'll get a lot of questions and hopefully have a lot of answers. I'm going to introduce Cynthia in just a minute. Before that, I know that we've been working with a lot of you already, and so I'd just like to take a quick minute to introduce our environmental team and some of our vendors that help us out. So Celine Finney, everybody. Angel Peltola, who is missing in action. Okay, there she is. Christy Morris, who is our tiger specialist. David Camarena, who's I'm sure a lot of you have worked with, is actually on vacation this week, so he's not here to introduce. And then we have Cynthia Zabranik, which I'm sure a lot of you who have done environmental training in the past have taken that with her. She actually is the person I took my first environmental training with. So that's the main environmental team that some of you may have been working with. And then we have our vendor, SWCA, that helps us out tremendously, and our programs would not be successful without them. So if you guys could just stand up real quick. Allison, Rob, Kevin, who's already standing. And that's okay, we're waiting on, I think, a few other people, Christy and Kevin. And is Rob Brian coming? No. Okay, yeah, everybody had a lot of traffic this morning. I hear ACL, so okay. With that, it's a long day. We've got a lot to cover, and we're hoping that it definitely does not go until 5. In fact, we've been directed to not go till 5, so they can clean this room up. So with that, I will pass it over to Cynthia.
Alrighty, I'm trying to make sure this. There we go. Ignore. Alrighty then, and just for quick reference here. There's your second slide in your packet that you downloaded from our box website, has everyone's contact info. So you've got their emails. And notice I put their emails, not their phone numbers. I would prefer you guys actually send things in writing, so that way you get answers back in writing. And it also helps out with time management for us. There's a lot of stuff going on, as you can guess, a lot of meetings and a lot of people running from here to there to everywhere, because we're here at SFA, we're at Lavaca, we're at Chase, so we're kind of all over the place. So if you guys could kind of hang into the emails to begin with, and we can always schedule a phone call after that. Again, I'm Cynthia Zabranik. Been with the state for more than 26 plus years. Just to give you a little background on me, the first 13 and a half years were actually with the regular CDBG program. So I do have extensive knowledge of CDBG. The second half of my state life was actually with environmental and environmental solely. Working with the housing agency and on various programs throughout that housing agency. And hearing that's going to be one of my first things. I just wanted to talk a little housekeeping with you real quick. Number one, most important thing, if you head out to the hall on either side of that large embankment where the elevators are heading towards security, women's bathrooms are on the left, men are on the south end over here. We have our cafeteria just outside the doors here if you need to grab something to drink. If you want to eat there, there's a few places out this direction because going that way is going to be a little bit tough with all the construction. There's a Mexican food place out this way, and we can tell you a few other suggestions when lunchtime comes. Today we're filled with a lot of information. We're going to try to cram it down into one day. So on some items we're just going to touch on it. On other things we're kind of go a little more in depth. And we're going to let you guys lead the way as far as questions go on that. On the other side of it as well, with your phones, if you could please put them on silent, I'd really appreciate that. That's one of my crazy pet peeves is hearing phones. So if you could do that, I'd appreciate it. If there are any smokers in the room, FYI, that is the smoking area right outside here, but caveat, those doors lock behind you. So have a partner that can let you back in if you're going to go and have a cigarette during one of our breaks. We are going to have a morning break, an afternoon break, and a lunch break. I'm going to try to keep them tight so that, again, we can get through all this material. So, just to kind of give you an idea of what we're talking about for our morning, we're going to be going through all the requirements, best practices, adopting other agencies' reviews. I'm sure a lot of people are curious about that one. Timelines, review levels, buyouts, and in the afternoon we're going to get deep into the elements. When we go into that, part of what we're going to be looking at are programmatic agreements and MOUs and maybe a few determinations we've already gotten from HUD already to this point. So please stick around for that because that will be important. They'll be part of the pieces that will help you put together those reviews. And I wanted to do just kind of quick check about who is in the room. There are people I recognize, and there are a lot of people I don't. So if you could, anybody that's an environmental consultant or an administrative consultant, can you raise your hands? Okay. Is there anybody here that represents a city or a county? Raise your hands. Okay. I always like the mix. Is there anybody here that doesn't fit either one of those? Yes, you state employees, you have to raise your hands too. Okay. Kind of a subset of that, are there any developers in this group? Okay, or anybody that works with developers for multifamily? Just curious. Okay. Just making sure. So let's go ahead and drift in. So I know for many, when they were looking at environmental, they're kind of looking at this. Okay, it's one of my favorite slides because it kind of explains exactly how everybody feels trying to go in. Environmental, I've always said, is sort of an if-then-else statement. So if you're a programmer or you program or do something like that, that's where that goes in there. If it's this, then it's that. Otherwise, it's this. So there's a lot of pieces that drop in there. So you see what's not necessarily a gray area, but maybe a flexible area in what we work in. However, there are some very hard stops within that as well, so don't forget about that. While I'm asking as well, I wanted to ask who all is doing their very first environmental they've ever done? Okay. Who all has been working on environmental for the past year and it's been 1 year? Okay. 5 years. 10 years. 15. 20. There's some hands I'm not seeing going up, so I'm going to keep going until I see them. 25. 30. Have I captured everybody? Is there somebody beyond the 30? Oh, look at that. Okay. 40. 50. Okay. 45. Okay, 45. Okay, there's somebody with 45 in the back. Okay, that's good to know. Now, what you are going to see, and I realize that many of you have probably worked with the regular CDBG program, have worked with the home program, and some of the other various funds that we've got out there that we've played with, NSP, TCAP, and some of the other stuff. There's a few changes that have come in with CDBG-DR, and they're not necessarily changes, but they're actually a more in-depth look. Part of that is because of the level of funding that we're dealing with. We're talking about billions of dollars. So we've got to be much more on point, shall we say, with this. With so much money, we're affecting larger swaths of area. So again, we've got to be very much on top of this. Let's see if I can figure this out. Yay! Okay, so one of the first things we're going to do, and I'm going to switch over this way so I'm closer to my slides, is talk about what an environmental review is. Most of you have done this. I've got one person in the back that's going to be doing their very first one, a few that have just barely started. But the reason for this is to have an analysis of the impacts for the project surrounding the surrounding environment around it, and it's kind of a vice versa thing. What is that project going to do to the surrounding area, and what is that surrounding area, how does it impact the project itself? So it's kind of an inside look and an outside look when you're looking at these things. You're going to ensure that your HUD-funded program, provides decent, safe, and sanitary housing, clean water, sanitary sewers, and provides us kind of safety as we're looking at some of the things that we're doing for mitigation as well. It protects the value of that federal investment because these are tax dollars. So we're always looking to make sure that we're spending them wisely and in the best fashion. It demonstrates the compliance of about 17 federal regulations, laws, authorities, executive orders. Encourages public transparency, okay, and participation. And that's one of our big main things. You hear us talking about postings. That's the whole point of this. People need to know what we're out there and what we're doing. So for those regulations, there's 3 main regulations we'll be looking at. You're going to hear us today talking a lot about Part 58, and it has to do with the local government review itself. Generally, if HUD's doing the review, they do what's called a Part 50 review. So anything that we relate to when you hear Part 58, 58.35, and all the other different little acronyms that go with it, that's where this is falling under. With this, we have what we call a responsible entity, and we'll get a little more into that as we roll into the slides. But basically, whatever locality that is, if you're representing a city or a county, which I think the majority of you are for some of this funding, that is going to be where that locality is actually the responsible entity. For Part 51, we're talking about man-made hazards. So we're talking about noise, we're talking about explosives and flammable, and we're talking about airport hazards. This is something additionally that HUD added onto this piece to add to NEPA, shall we say. And then Part 55, our super favorite one, that has to do with floodplains and wetlands. That provides us with all the guidance, or most of the guidance, shall we say, that we're working through. That also helps us meet the executive orders for floodplain and wetland. And provides kind of some guidance for that 8-step process, which we'll talk a little bit about today as well. I also wanted to make sure and, if I can look this right, point out down here, I'm going to have a few different websites that we're going to be flashing up here. And I've got to remember to turn this way because they're recording. So as they're flashing up there, this particular one actually links you back to the disaster relief page for HUD Exchange. How many in this room have actually gone on HUD Exchange? Okay, I'm very happy to see that. That is the best place to get guidance and information. Beyond the fact that it has all the forms that you should be utilizing, and by the way, they do update those without telling us. So always step in there and make sure and pull those forms from that website. Also for the publications, they have the publications on there. They have what they call samples. We call them templates. We want you to use those. But as well, they have FAQs, and they have something called the Wiser. So as we kind of touch on a few things today, you can go on the HUD Exchange website onto Wiser and actually go in and take the course, shall we say, as you roll through at your own timing, okay? And it will cover noise. It will cover explosive and flammable. It will cover floodplain. It puts floodplain and wetlands and clean water all together, sole source aquifer all together in one big unit called water resources. So again, that is a fantastic resource for you guys to utilize. So who is responsible? I mentioned the comment about responsible entity. So we're kind of considering these, I guess you could say, state disaster funds, which, by the way, the slides that we're looking at today are 99% from HUD slides. They were kind enough to provide me slides from Region 2, Region 6, and one other region which I can't remember the number of, but it's the Kansas City area, for us to pull all our slides from and information. They've actually had 2 different workshops regarding disaster relief specifically, and a lot of those slides are incorporated in here, as well as the regular training slides. And again, we've tried to kind of cut these down, and you may see a few slides, and I may roll through them quickly because, again, we've got a kind of a short day, but I wanted you to have the slide and have that information that's on the slide. Which, by the way, there are 11 slides in here that are not part of HUD, and I want you to guess which ones they are because they're not in your packet, okay? You never know, I might buy you a Starbucks if you can guess which ones. So, for state disaster funds, the grants are going to the local governments themselves. They flow through the general land office. The local government, however, is going to act as the responsible entity. They're taking the responsibility for this. What that means is when you're submitting what's called a request for release of funds, that will go to the state of Texas. You'll send that to GLO. We are acting as HUD in that instance. We actually wear 2 hats when it comes to this funding. For the grants to the others, and that's why I was asking if there are others in here, we're talking about nonprofits, for-profits, quasi-governmental, a council of governments, something to that effect. When they're acting in that, and that could be for like a multifamily development, okay? So they're going through another entity, but we've actually awarded out there because we're trying to get that money out. The state steps up and acts as the responsible entity for that, and we sign off. When that happens, we forward all that information to HUD headquarters. So the request for release of fund goes to them, and they deal with the actual federal objection period. So some of the responsibilities we have as the General Land Office, we approve the request for release of funds. We make the release. I laugh that he actually talks about a removal of grant condition. That's actually true. Any of the contracts that your localities have gone into with the state of Texas have a condition in there regarding an environmental review. That's one of the caveats that you have, is that they'll release the funds based on an environmental review. So this is a removal of that grant condition, okay? You're actually meeting that. We maintain a log of what's coming in and going out. We provide technical assistance, and we monitor. Okay, when I say monitor, don't forget my very favorite thing that one of my friends that was a monitor for many, many years, for 30 plus years, said, if it's not in writing, it didn't happen. So remember, whatever you're doing in writing, that's why I suggest emails, because that's in writing, your response in writing. And you hang on to those, put those as part of your file, please. And sometimes every once in a while, if we've discussed something with you and you come back on the phone to talk to us, you may ask us that same question, but in a different way. Remind us with that email. You've saved it and said, well, here was our discussion last time. This is what I'm talking about. And that kind of pops our, a little reminder in our brain to go, oh, that's right, okay. Because depending upon how you formulate the question and the information you've provided, which I'm sure we've asked for more question before we've provided that information to you, that gives us a better picture to really answer, to make an actual decision over that. So best practices. This comes from one of another region, and I thought it was an excellent idea to include it. Coordinate early with your state or local government agencies, and that is key because it takes a while to do that environmental review. Become familiar with the environmental guidelines at that HUD exchange. That is a fantastic resource. Again, I can't talk more about it. Hire consultants if they're needed, okay? If you need the capacity, if once you go through this training today, you go, I don't think so, which I've actually had people tell me at the end of a 3-day training, which is what we usually do, that this is a little bit more than what they bargained for, so they're gonna go out and hire for that. And that is actually an eligible cost. Use the Secretary of State's SOI, that qualified person, to help complete those 1 to 6 reviews. That's actually kind of a requirement now. And that came through the Federal Register. That was one of the things that they put out there as part of our new guidance and what they require when they did the allocations for these disaster relief funds. Adopt FEMA reviews whenever possible if you can. That will shorten you. So this is another methodology that you can utilize. You just have to do it properly. And prepare the ERR in HEROES if you have access. What I will tell you though, when you do HEROES, is just one caveat, having played in there many times, is that all those myriad of questions that it asks you, much like those worksheets that you utilize if you're filling some of this stuff out to help you work through it, not all those answers translate into the document that it creates, so you may have to go back in there and edit those in to add a little more information, because we expect a little more in there. And you also need to be sure and pick out the option that provides a signature at the bottom, because we do expect to have a signature from the preparer at the bottom, as well as if it's an EA, the certifying officer. Alrighty, again, I'm pointing out, and I will keep pointing out, all the required forms are actually located on HUD Exchange. And I know people like to drop those down and keep them and hang on to them and use them over and over and over again. If you're starting a brand new grant with us, please go on there and take a peek at what's online and make sure that they still match out if there's something that you need to change or update or whatever. Because we have gotten in the past, I don't know how many months, many forms of these particular checklists, and they're not quite right. Yes, ma'am.
Is it okay to change the font style on the forms that we download? Because they come up as Times New Roman, and to me that's hard to read.
Okay. The question was, can we at least change the font on the forms? Yeah, if you want to change the font, that's okay. What we're asking you to not do is to change what's in it or the questions or how it's laid out. Many times what I notice is that people will completely, as they're editing through, they completely leave out the portion that tells me how much money you got, okay, or what the total cost of the project is, and we have to send that back and go, so we need to know a few things. So the more information that's on there, the more complete it is, the quicker we can get you in and out, because that's really, truly our goal. As you can see behind me, this is kind of, on that main page, as you scroll down, there's a section that says Formats. The forms themselves are actually named for the level of review. Okay, so if you're exempt or categorically excluded not subject to, it's the exact same form. Let me turn without, it's literally listed right there, okay? As you'll notice as well, on those forms, it'll say Part 50 and Part 58. So again, reminder, we're Part 58, that's what we're looking at. So when you're looking for a categorically excluded subject to form, that's there, and you want the one that says Part 58. Make sure you get that one, not Part 50. They are different. Not categorically excluded. Environmental assessment, Part 58, again up there, and hopefully very few, if none, hopefully EISs, but that's actually, I think, also located on there. And important, okay? They're putting in a different piece here, and they're actually reading straight from the reg. This has to do with choice limiting actions, okay? You hear that phrase a lot, and HUD is very serious about that. You cannot go into a contract, you cannot award a contract, you cannot start construction until you have completed your environmental assessment, okay? So if you've gone out and optioned land, perhaps you're doing a drainage project or you're doing multifamily, you can get an option or a conditional agreement on that land. That option or conditional agreement needs to have some specific language in it about environmental. So make sure that that's included in there. If you have questions about that, contact us and we can give you that language. That's also on the HUD Exchange. They have examples of that conditional language. But make sure that you do that. However, do not close on that land until you have gotten environmental clearance, period, in writing. So you've got to have that authority to use grant funds in hand. And again, I love it down here, don't spend a dime. And they do mean that, don't spend a dime. The few things that you can spend on before that happens, because they're considered exempt, and that'll be the document that you guys probably send in with the applications, is that exempt form. You're going to be exempting out of the actual environmental, doing administrative pieces, some testing. So if you need to go out and do some kind of lead testing or do an asbestos survey or whatever, that's covered under exempt. So you can go out and do that prior to getting your clearance, and actually you'll probably have to. And again, this is talking about any kind of physical activities or financial activities that create a commitment. That's why we say you can't award towards that specific home or property or whatever it is you're working on, because then that locks it in. If we find something that's very wrong that we need to mitigate for, and part of that may be rerouting, okay? Part of that may be not using this portion of the land. It may be redesigning what you're putting on the land because it's impacting something else. That's a harder thing to do if you've already dropped your money on that. It's this one, okay? The other side of that is, if you do that, you have now created a violation. It's called a 5822 violation. At that point, we would have to request a waiver from HUD. Those take somewhere, if you get the waiver, between 9 and 12 months. And you can't move until you have the waiver in place. So even though you were quickly trying to get something, you have now shot yourself in the foot because you're going to be waiting a good year before you can actually commence. So I send out that warning big, hard, and heavy because there's always something that happens. And by the way, let me go backwards on that. No after the fact reviews, period. Oh, okay.
We have a consultant who's been telling us that choice limiting actions include the homeowner making any changes to a property after he has applied for the program before he has received the funds.
Right, who has it? We're going to bring you a microphone. You guys can't hear her with the microphone, but this is actually to record. All of this, by the way, is being recorded. So if some of your colleagues or some of the other people that you know that were not able to attend, this is going to be recorded. And horrifyingly, they're actually videoing this and not just the slides, which I'm terrified about.
My question was, we have a consultant who has been advising us that a homeowner may not make any additional changes or improvements to his property after, for instance, he's enrolled in the program, say the home assistance program, and but has not yet received an environmental review, or will limit his actions. And that seems a little bit stringent because certainly there's some things that he might want to be doing while he's waiting.
I want to repeat your question since it's recorded. Well, actually it is recorded, but I want you guys to hear that. Did everybody hear her? Could you hear what she was asking? Okay, what she was asking about is they've been advised that they are not allowed to let the homeowner make any changes to their property after they've made application to our program for assistance. That's a hard one because that goes to, it is their same property, and I tell you what, and I purposely brought my little thing up here. I actually asked our disaster relief rep at HUD to be available for me. So when we have our first break, I'm going to ask her because that's very specific, and you know what? I'm not quite sure, and I don't want to give you the wrong answer on that because choice limiting, again, can be something that really, stops everything right in its tracks.
I think the only thing I would add to that is I think it is very dependent upon the activity. So, for example, for our reimbursement program,
Over here.
we're doubly recorded. I think it is dependent upon the project activities and the program guidelines, and we will get you a definitive answer. But for example, our reimbursement program with the state is very stringent on, because we have to provide receipts and tie back the damage to the storm. So we can reimburse them for certain things that happened to their home, but we have to be able to have evidence to tie it back to damages related to the disaster. So it might be a cautionary. Jeannie, I'm sorry. I'm not sure, but we'll ask Kelly on the first break if she has anything definitive, but I don't recall seeing anything written like that that I can remember. Rob, have you had any experience with that?
Yeah, some programs can add assistance to the family. And if the person
Rob?
That's a good idea.
You're definitely being recorded.
Oh, great. I changed my mind. So we should definitely check with Kelly, but in previous disasters that we've been working on, there is the opportunity for the homeowner to continue work, but there will be a penalty. So the work that is done will not be reimbursed in any way, usually if you're in direct assistance. And then if they have completed the work, the amount that was in the award or the amount that was expected to be going to the builder would be reduced accordingly. So it becomes very complicated. So it's something that the homeowner wants to be cautioned about, definitely. But at the same time, there might have to be some guidelines that are developed specifically for this. Yeah.
Okay, so more to come. We'll try to get something in writing from HUD. Did I see a question at the back?
From my experience in Louisiana, what we did under the homeowner repair program, which is guidance that we were given, but not formally, which is one thing you might want to bring up, is that they had an evidentiary form that when they applied to the program, they had to sign a form saying they understand the continued work with no change orders to the original scope of work, but all clarification of people was I want to bring that up to you and talk to Kelly with that confirmation.
Yeah, I agree. I think you have the opportunity when you're standing up a program, whoever the entity is doing that, to write things into your action plan that HUD will approve early on. And so not knowing exactly what those were for Harris County, I think we have to defer, but I think proceed with caution on anything like that. So it's definitely better to be a bit conservative, and here comes Rob with some more info.
Yeah, sorry. I did want to stress this.
And you're on film.
As Cynthia said, I'm going to ignore that part. As Cynthia said at the first slide, this is especially important if any of your applicants are in historic districts or have historic homes. Any work that they do themselves could actually disqualify them. So that's another thing that you'll see in the site-specific checklist if you're doing a single-family repair home or a single-family residential for the HAB. So just something else I wanted to mention.
Yeah, and I understand there's going to be things that they're going to want to do as far as cleanup goes, but again, that's where that becomes a caution, because generally we tell you not to do anything. And again, these go back to some things that go into program. There's some things that go into qualifications, so that's why we want to kind of get that clarification for you. All righty, we're going to keep on rolling. Does anybody have any other questions? All righty. So,
Can you just mention that if they do have a question, Angel's going to bring the
okay. If you guys do have a question, by the way, Angel over here is going to be our Vanna White. She's going to walk around and give you that microphone. And I hate to say, but that microphone won't actually let everybody else hear you. But it will provide for the recording that's on here, so we can always go back. I will repeat that question for you if you can't hear them, and as we go, we'll proceed. But anyway, we want to have something crystal clear for those people that are listening later. So again, no after-the-fact reviews. That's something that we don't really do. There's one slight exception to that, and that's our HRP program, because obviously something's happened ahead of time, and we're reimbursing for that. But that has more to do with programmatic guidelines. All righty, we have what we call a coordination with FEMA for CDBG-DR projects. Did you want to talk about this a little bit more, or? This is something they've been doing a little bit more of, so I wanted to kind of pull her aside. On this, when HUD and FEMA are doing a joint project together, we've kind of had an outline here behind us, and I'll kind of read through it for you. The HUD or HUD responsible entity can adopt that FEMA review if the scope of work has not been changed. The HUD funds cover the local cost share, which can be the match. Grantee notifies HUD with a request for release of funds, but without observing any kind of public comment period. So as that comes in, you provide that complete review and that request for release of funds. We have more information on that actual HUD memo, and that was part of the handouts that we placed on the box. So be sure and drop that down for you. I'll let you, if there's anything else you want to expand on.
Okay, yeah, I think to make comment on this, so typically we do see FEMA reviews. However, we are allowed to adopt other federal reviews, not just FEMA, which is great. So for example, Sam had a project that had a USDA EA that was prepared, and it passed the environmental review in the sense that it was compliant and sufficient for our standards. So what that means is that the parcel that EA covered could be adopted into the rest of the EA, and therefore they don't have to do an environmental review for that parcel, that portion of the project, which is great. We highly recommend using this. The caveat with that is that it has to be obviously a federally approved EA, and it has to meet the standards as what HUD would consider in GLO. And so GLO doesn't have a formal way of how we're going to do this. So basically, as of now, we're asking people to, when you have the opportunity to have access to a federal review that you can adopt into your project, to send us an email, which we'll go through the email contacts in a few minutes, saying we have this federal document, whatever it could be from USDA. Lots of the times it's going to be FEMA. We want to incorporate it into our project and basically exempt ourselves from having to do, let's say it's a 500-mile pipeline. The first 250 miles are covered by this EA. It'd be fantastic if you didn't have to do a replica of work. So we're trying to really get away from duplicative work that's already used federal funds. So we encourage this. Like Cynthia said, the memo is attached to the slides. Okay, the memo is attached, and it's confusing because the memo specifically talks about Sandy. HUD used Sandy as an example, and this was the first time it was used that they said, okay, let's start not doing duplicative efforts. So the good news is that we have them from HUD in writing that we can use it for Sandy forward for all disasters. So it doesn't mean it's limited just to Sandy. So I know we have a lot of people in the room working on 15 and 16 floods as well as Harvey. So for any of those disasters, we can use this adopting a federal review. Any questions on that, Sam?
What about?
Oh yeah, sorry, I forget too. Thank you, Angel.
What about reviews performed by, say, TxDOT, if it's a part of the federal bridge replacement program?
So the problem is, what I think if you remember, we got into it with HUD a little bit about this. It has to do with the Stafford Act funding clause, and so it has to. Do you have it on there?
I do.
Next. Okay, so. I'll let Cynthia finish it. But the answer is that's going to be one of the things that GLO is going to check when you submit this federal review for us to review, is that it does meet this federal funding act for emergency assistance. So I'll let Cynthia finish your question on that.
Alrighty, as we kind of roll through on here. Just to let you know, when you pull up that actual adoption that you're looking at for the FEMA regulations, it also talks about this piece as well and lays out exactly what you can and can't do. If you kind of pull up, and I actually, just for grins, pulled up the Stafford Act and pulled out the pieces that it's talking about on here. So when it's talking about 402, 403, 404, it's talking about general federal assistance, hazard mitigation, federal facility, well, not federal facilities, repair, restoration and replacement of damaged facilities, debris removal. So it's kind of going into super specific things that they allow for in that funding. So that's what they're kind of talking about on here. So HUD grantees are permitted to adopt the environmental reviews performed by other federal agencies when the HUD grantee is providing supplemental assistance to actions performed under, again, sections 402, 403, 404, 406, 407, and 408C4, very specific, and 502 emergency assistance under the Stafford Act. This actually, on your slide there, you'll have a link that takes you straight to that again, and may actually give you a little bit more information. But again, along with your slides, I went ahead and put in a lot of those PAs and the MOUs and some of the other things that we're adopting here. In here, it actually kind of outlines it. Whoops. And as you can see, I have probably reviewed it just a little bit because you can see all the highlights here. Okay, so it goes in and kind of explains a few other items about how you can adopt and what needs to be in place and what else you have to do on this. Okay. I don't want to go through too many specifics on here because, again, it's all laid out actually pretty nicely on here. But the big main thing is that if you see on here it's saying supplemental assistance. What supplemental assistance means, there's no change in scope. So whatever it is that you're trying to adopt and fund has to be that project. If you're wanting to take that project and expand on it, it's only this portion of it. Okay, she talked about that 500-mile or 500-yard or 500 feet pipeline or whatever, and you did the review for the first 250. That's your review for the first 250. Now you've got to come and take care of the other 250, okay? You can't expand on that. It's what it is right there. You can probably use some of the documents that they have, but again, you've got to expand that and likely have to publish again for that piece. This is adopting something that you are actually just adding funding into to ensure that it goes. So the environmental review record, written record of environmental decision making. This is an incredibly important file that you're going to have online, okay? It has to be available to the public, so if somebody wants to request a copy of that environmental review, they should be able to get it. Courts, auditors, this is considered the administrative record. This is the thing that tells the story of what you're looking at. What I would caution you about is to not release people's names. So if you're doing a tiered review that has site specifics and you have that person's name that's related to, please redact that person's name. That shouldn't be part of the record that goes out. Anything that has any kind of personal information on an individual that you're working with, make sure that that's not part of what goes out. It has to be prepared and approved before actions are taken. Again, there's that choice limiting piece again. And let the ERR tell your story. Again, everything that's in there that you're having to work through to figure out what you're placing and where you're placing it, any kind of mitigation that you've looked at, all the questions that it asks you in there, that's your story. That's the information that it has. It shouldn't just be the supporting documents, although those should support the conclusions that you have, but it should be the conclusions that you create, period, on those checklists. That should tell your story. Don't just say, it meets this reg. I hate that. It should say it meets this reg because, according to blah, blah, blah. Okay, we need to understand why, then have to go dig at your map and go, well, I think it's because, no, it needs to actually provide a conclusion and point to the support documentation that we're talking about. Alrighty, this is teeny tiny and kind of semi-teeny tiny. Still teeny tiny to me on here. This is just kind of going through the process itself. No, I was looking for the pointer. In this, and let me kind of turn this way. It can still pick me up right here, right? Okay. Anyways, you're kind of going through, up here on the top, it's talking about defining your project. Once you define that project and aggregate, you're also looking at determining the level of review. These are the various levels of review that are possible with these projects that we're looking at. As you go in here, it's actually taking you through the process of what forms you're going to utilize, what regulations you've got to meet, and actually, it's so tiny I don't even want to look at it. And actually, it really is, and I'm kind of blind. Anyway, on this piece that's up here, if you look at that very first row, it's actually telling you exempt, okay? The next one is categorically excluded, not subject to 58.5. Categorically excluded, subject to 58.5, and I promise that subject to part and not subject to will make more sense for you in a second. And environmental assessment. Those are your levels. These are the pieces you go through. Every last one of these levels will always have to look at 58.6 every single time. That's a portion of it every single time. The next piece that you're looking at is 58.5, which is this big thing that we used to call the statutory checklist, because it has all these various laws and regulations that we follow. That piece is the 58.5 that you're subject to if you're categorically excluded, subject to. If you're not subject to, then that's a piece that you don't have to look at. You're only looking at that first piece for 58.6. And as we go through here, all the numbers will make a little more sense. When you go into an EA, now you're adding yet another piece that goes into it. You're having to do a NEPA review. So you're going into a little bit deeper into those same subjects, some of them, and a little bit further about land use. The other piece that they're kind of showing in here is the fact that you have to publish most of the time. If you're exempt or categorically excluded, not subject to, you do not publish. There is no comment period. There's nothing that goes into that. And that's because that's a specific level, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a few minutes. As you move over into the things that actually have impact, you will actually turn dirt, something that has a physical impact. Those are the things that are categorically excluded subject to and an EA, an environmental assessment. Those are the ones that we are looking to publish and or have comment periods. And I'm going to wait on the categorically excluded subject to. I'm going to call it CADX when we go forward because that's too much. Those have all the various publications, comment periods, the submissions to us with that request release of funds. But you can see it's got a specific flow. And again, there are the if this, then that kind of statements that roll with this. I'm going to take it to this one. I like it better. On this, you can kind of see again all the various levels of review, and it shows you how these things kind of add to. So if I'm exempt and CADX not subject to, again, it's only going to be those first three pieces that we ever look at, but it builds each time, okay? So everybody does that one. As you come up a little bit closer to the CADX subject to, EA and EIS, those all include the compliance piece with the other 13 or 14 different regulations that we look at. As we roll in a little bit further to the EA, now we're doing a NEPA analysis. As you're doing an EIS, it actually goes to the CEQ EIS requirements. So that's a much more in-depth and very many years later process that you're looking at. When you're subject to EA and EIS, there are again notifications that are involved, and of course all three of those have an authority to use grant funds before you can proceed. I wanted to provide for you a little cheat sheet to give you some examples of what we're looking at. So if you happen to have printed that out or you've got it on your computer, you might want to go ahead and pull it up. This is the summary of levels of environmental review. This is actually a HUD document that they created 1,000,000 years ago, and it's still quite valid. It looks teeny tiny on here, but I want to use it as we kind of roll through what some of this stuff is. So exempt and categorically excluded, not subject to. Back in the day when HUD created these regulations, they had exempt, CADX, and EA. For the exempt items, there were a few other things that they were looking at that they felt like really shouldn't be exempt, but they also didn't rise to the level of that categorically excluded subject to, rolling through all those other various regulations that they had to do. So they added to CADX and made it not subject to. So that's where that comes from. When you're looking at these for exempt, you're looking at things that have no physical impact by their very nature. So you're not going out lifting a hammer, you're not digging stuff up. Exempt activities, again, as I mentioned, and you can go straight down your little piece here, are talking about resource identification, environmental and other studies. So if you're doing multifamily, they're doing a phase 1 ESA. Information and financial services, maybe they're setting up accounts. Administrative and management activities. Public services, that goes to another piece, and we reach out and deal with that as well in our disaster. Inspections and testing for hazards or defects. Again, if we have to go out and do inspections to begin with. Purchase of any kind of insurance and tools, engineering, technical assistance and training, and the dreaded temporary or permanent improvements that do not alter the environment. Be very careful with that one, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second.
I just wanted to add that we will not be doing EISs in the Harvey program. So
Sorry,
if
do
you,
that where you can see me?
yeah, I will come up to the mic so everybody can hear me. But it's good for basic common knowledge of the outline of the classifications. But because an EIS takes so long and we are limited on the years of funding, how fastly we have to spend those funds, we can't do an EIS. So hopefully nobody has any planned EISs coming to us because we won't be able to accept them. And I think a lot of the grant managers are in the room as well here, who would be a great resource too for everybody to kind of coordinate that. But if you have questions thinking that your project and project description exceeds the threshold of an EA, please reach out to the environmental team and we can help you make that determination. But if you feel like it's moving towards an EIS, then that's something to let the applicant know right away.
And that's a good point. If you've ever dealt with, and some of you in the room actually have, those can take 2 years and more to actually create. That's why we're trying to stay away from that and actually staying away from it. So categorically excluded subject to, I'm going to touch on super quick because I want to keep going. If you peek at your, yeah, I did go that way. If you peek at your little cheat sheet on here, it takes you into acquisition, repair, improvement, reconstruction, or rehab of public facilities and improvements. So if we're talking about infrastructure, replacement of water and sewer lines, note that word replacement. Replacement means that 2-inch line with a 2-inch line, that 4-inch line with a 4-inch line, not the 4-inch line with a 6-inch line, okay? Be very careful about that because that goes to capacity. Reconstruction of curbs and sidewalks, repaving of streets, so it's an existing street. For single family, we're talking about unit density is not increased beyond 4 units. Project doesn't involve change in land use, a big flag. The footprint of the building is not increased into a floodplain or a wetland. For multifamily, unit density doesn't change more than 20%. The cost of rehab is less than 75% of the estimated cost of replacement. New construction is not a part of this, okay? FYI, make that crystal clear. Non-residential structures, new construction on multifamily. Non-residential structures, facilities and improvements were in place and will not be changed in size or capacity by more than 20%. Activity does not involve change in land use from non-residential to residential, commercial to industrial, or one industrial use to another, okay? Individual actions, that goes to your single-family homes. If you are doing a reconstruction, there are certain limits that you can fall under for categorically excluded. There's a grouping that you can't do when it comes to this. You can't have more than 4 homes within 2,000 feet of each other. So likely in this program, we're always going to be going up to an EA for that because we're doing huge swaths of homes if that's what you're working on. An acquisition can fall under this. So again, remember, note thresholds related to any kind of increase in changes of size, density, cost, land use, and building footprint. I'm going to keep blowing through that. Oh. For the EA, that's the simplest one. If it doesn't fit under any one of the previous categories, it's an EA. However, there are things within that EA that may push it up to that EIS level. So again, pay particular attention to that because as you just heard, we are not going to be approving those types of projects. So typical timelines for this. This is also HUD provided. Some of the times it takes a little bit longer, sometimes it takes less time. Generally, the typical timeline that we've looked at for a categorically excluded project is anywhere from 45 to 75 days, okay? You're having to reach out to various agencies, you're getting correspondence, you're doing some type of study. That falls in there. What doesn't fall in here is extraneous things. If you had to do that 8-step piece for floodplain or wetland, that's additional to this. So this is not inclusive of that. This is not inclusive of your publications. This is talking about creating the review itself. So 45 to 75 days if it's categorically excluded. If it's an EA, it's typically 60 to, I think it says 110 days. And that's pretty accurate. I know there's some people that can create and pull a lot of things up very quickly, but when it comes to some of that correspondence, you're not going to be speeding along on that. Many of them have a 30-day period that we allow for them to respond. So you have to wait that entire 30 days. Don't send something out to the tribes and then suddenly submit your review for us to look at because you have not completed that time period for them to respond. Alrighty, we're going to touch on tiering really quick, and I'm going to kind of blow through it. They had more slides than I really wanted. But basically, tiering is appropriate when you're doing things where you don't know the sites. So this could be something utilized for single-family homes. This could be used for buyouts, okay, especially if we're doing voluntary buyouts and we're not quite sure. We may have a target area, but we don't know who's going to take the bite of that to actually come in and do the buyout. Okay, so that's a possibility. There are several different ways you can look into dealing with that type of program. It may also go to anything from, I've heard them use it in the regular CDBG program when they're doing yard lines. Okay, they're not sure which houses they're going to hit. They've gone through their study, but they know the approximate area. So they actually tiered that and brought it down to that. So what is tiering? It's used when all project sites are not known, as I said. The objective is to actually roll through as many of those elements that we have to review and clear those at that broad level if possible. Now, you've got a document for that very clearly about how you're clearing that. Those pieces that cannot be cleared at that broad review roll into the site-specific. But you don't just simply say we're going to the site-specific, you also lay out the protocol for how you're going to review that. That's one of the changes that has had on their checklist now, that they're requiring that. That's something in the past we hadn't done. You accomplish that through that tiering plan that we used to have. Now the tiering plan is incorporated in the same checklist, and you outline exactly how it is that you're going to work on these projects, and if there's issues with those, how you're going to mitigate. So the entire plan is actually incorporated into this piece. As you're looking at these again, you'll go through both pieces, and I'm going to kind of cut through. I kept the slides in there so that you would have them in hand for your own use, but I'm actually going to kind of speed through. And I wanted to kind of step back a little bit because I wanted to make sure I incorporated everything that's in here. For that project description when you're doing this, you need to make sure that all contemplated activities are listed. So if down payment assistance is going to be a piece that you're going to do later on, please incorporate that in, or else you're doing another review for that. Everything that's in that project description is part of what you're looking at. Make sure it has enough detail to utilize as part of that supporting documentation for some of those elements. Sometimes you're explaining to us why you don't need to look at this element based on that project description. Well, make the project description have enough information that I look at that and go, they're right, they're absolutely correct. So it's got to have that information about location. Speaking of location, maps, okay, that should be part of your project description. You should have location maps, and not with a pin stuck somewhere, with an actual outline. Here's the area that we're looking at. Here's the county that we're going into our broad review for. Here is the multifamily complex piece of property that we're going to develop, or that we're reconstructing, or perhaps we're buying it out and we're clearing it away and returning it. So those are the kind of things that we want to look at. If you've got target areas that you're looking at, outline that target area. Also, send back a larger view so we know where it's located within the community and maybe located within the state. Sometimes that's very helpful. Or the county itself, which I actually stepped on this thing. All proposed funding sources so we can understand where the money's coming from. Sometimes if you're doing something, again, multifamily, and it's got tax credit funds in it and I don't have all the information I want, I'll go to the TDHCO website and pull down the information off their website. There's a lot of information that's available for those tax credit properties when they do the underwriting reports. They display those publicly, so I'm able to actually pull that up. Be sure and have all proposed funding sources, estimated costs of the project, that total estimated cost, we've got to have that. So if there's other funds, or we can see that there's no other funds perhaps. We also want to know what the maximum number of units that are going to be on that property, okay, or for how many properties you're going to do. I'm going to do 16 homes, I'm going to do 25 properties, I'm going to do whatever. The acreage or size of that footprint that you're going to be utilizing, okay? So if you are doing a basin that you're going to be capturing all the rainwater in, we want to know size and scope of that. Give us the parameters of that. That also goes into depth, okay? Because that triggers so many other different things that we're looking at, including historic, which we'll kind of go into a little bit later. Maximum cost per unit. Identify if it's a tiered review. Is this a tiered review, or do we know exactly what we're doing? The other side of those buyouts, if you know exactly where you're going, and maybe you're going to use eminent domain to clear this whole section, you know exactly where you're going. You can do one review, period. No need to do a tiered review because you've got your site. You know exactly where you're going, who you're clearing out, and what you're doing. So you'll use that one piece. Geographic range. Again, let us know, is this for this community, this part of the city? Is it only for the east side of the city? Is it for this particular neighborhood? Is it for this section of the city that we're serving through water and sewer? Who all is this going to benefit, and where all is it going to go? Be sure and incorporate that area. And grant management staff back there, I'm going to look at you. When they're doing your project descriptions for a lot of this, you're going to be following your contract and what's in that attachment that you have for your performance statement. But also remember, if you think that you're still in design, you haven't quite done it, leave parameters for that. I'm not saying double the project by any stretch, but do have parameters in there, because if you go outside of the area that you cleared, at the very least it'll be a reevaluation, and it could be a republication if we're having to add other sections, okay? On that, also with another caveat, just because you got it environmentally cleared does not mean it's okay with program. Don't ever assume just because you got an environmental clearance for some particular piece that program's going to let you keep going down that road and go further. Okay, you need to chat with them, talk about if that's allowable, if that's an amendment that has to happen, and whatever else happens. Just remember, there's specific things that you have to meet for program in your contract, and then here's your environmental review. We're just looking at what you present to us. I may not realize that you're only doing this piece because you've expanded to here. So just keep that in mind. That's not your green light to run off and go do this stuff. Expiration date. These reviews are good for 5 years, so place that on there. Alrighty, project description. It can help determine the level of review. It doesn't help, it actually will determine the level of review, okay? And the potential time for that authority to use grant funds. There may be other things that we have to ask for. There may be some wetland issues that roll in that we have to go to the Corps, and that may be extending out when we think we're going to actually clear. We need to know if it's rehab versus reconstruction. We've had several reviews that have come in that when people have gone out for inspection, suddenly what we thought was a recon is really a rehab. There's different pieces that we look at as we're going along, as we're following, as we're monitoring, as we're inspecting, that we need to know. So if anything changes, remember that notification has to come back to us to let us know we flipped from rehab to recon. Okay, so if I'm doing reconstruction, now it's a higher level of looking at some of those pieces. If you flipped backwards, you're still covered environmentally, but we just need to know that you went back to a rehab because that helps us when we're actually doing monitoring. So we're not looking for the wrong thing. We need to know if there's new construction or no new construction. So again, all those parameters, all those details are on there. I'm not asking for how many nails you're using or how much cement you're pouring or whatever else it is, but we need to have a good enough picture to understand what's going on. The location, is there a location map? Okay, remember we just talked about that? Are there multiple locations? Okay, so if you're doing something, you know, if you're repairing a road in specific spots, you need to be able to map that out for us and show us where that's located throughout the community, because that has an impact on that area, not just in those little spots, okay? You can create a table with starts and stops, okay? I know that in the old CDBG program, which they probably still do it, they say on this street from here to here, okay? So lay out and say where this is going. We need to have a visual in our heads of what it is. We should be able to find that ourselves if we go and drive out there. Is the project location adjacent or proximal to a floodplain, a floodway, or a wetland? Is there a historic or archaeological site? Those could make a difference in your review. Don't just focus in on the one little piece of property. You've got to remember what's around you, okay? Because that may change exactly how you're looking at that review. So related laws. So we're going to be evaluating 17 environmental laws, authorities under 58.5 and 58.6. You've heard me talk about a little bit about this. And I'm sorry I'm talking super fast, but I'm trying to make sure we get everything in here. Again, you'll be resolving on the broad level as much as you can, and whatever doesn't rolls to the site specific. You will define, again, the written protocol, as we said. So policy standard processing to achieve that compliance on the site specific level. If you're in a floodplain, what are you going to do? And be sure to check with your locality on that, because you do have local floodplain managers. So I'm going to drop over here and go into the request for release of funds. The good thing about tiering on many of these items is that you can actually do your publications up front. Okay, and when you do those publications, you take care of the comment periods. That's taken care of in one fell swoop. So when it's time to look at those site specifics, you've identified that the property that you're working on. Now you're reviewing that one little piece, and you don't have to republish. So you're done with that. Of course, unless it's in a floodplain, then that's a whole other thing. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, because there's actually some wiggle room on that with the Federal Register. But you've got to complete that request for release of fund process itself and actually obtain an authority to use grant funds. Once you have that authority to use grant funds in hand, you can begin submitting those site specifics. I'm going to cut through. Alrighty, so record keeping, make sure that you have that broad review and all the site specifics that are associated with it in the same file. If you have multiple broad reviews for different areas or different, maybe you're doing buyouts over here and you're doing single family rehab reconstruction over here, you can probably combine that, but likely you're going to do something separate. They happened at different times. If you've got site specifics that are associated with each, they need to be with those specific pieces. They need to be grouped together. And again, remember, if it's not in writing, it didn't happen. So keep everything that you have in writing, okay? On some of this, we have, depending upon, because it's a little bit different for us with this program, we do have some vendors that did some of the broad reviews for us, and they may have already created a format for you. Generally, if you're working with a locality that is now getting funding through Harvey and through, is it 16 that's coming out right now?
Well, we have the mitigation funds.
The
We have
mitigation.
15 and 16 are already funded.
Okay.
Harvey, and then mitigation funding will be
Okay.
covered. I don't know how applicable that would be immediately.
So again, the Harvey, the mitigation funding, all this good stuff, you're going to be creating your own site-specific checklist when you do that broad review, okay? Be sure, and it's up to you to put what you would like on there. For me, I say you put those things that you are reviewing specifically for that time. You don't have to pull out the old checklist and then fill those in. Just hone it down to exactly what it is that you're looking at, okay? If you want to take that site-specific checklist and make some canned language on it, that's fine, but be careful about that so that you have some things that can switch out based on what you find, okay? And again, we're always here to help you when you're forming those kind of things. Buyout and acquisition. Yes, ma'am. Wait a minute. She's gonna record you.
Can you talk about the record retention requirements for the DRR?
As far as
The time that we're required to obtain documents?
forever. No, just kidding. If I'm remembering right, isn't it 5 years after the close of the contract?
Yeah, I think GLO specifically,
Can you go to the mic?
Everybody has their own schedule, so that's why I have to ask.
yeah, I believe GLO specifically, we are required for 5 years. It's 5 or 8. Celine, do you remember? 7, 5, 7, or 8. Any of the grant managers remember exactly? 5, yeah. 5 years. So we are required to keep everything for 5 years on file. So if you're acting as the responsible entity, Julia, especially for the city of Houston, it's going to be your determination on what those requirements are specifically for you. For monitoring events for us, when we monitor the city of Houston for your files, it's kind of, again, up to you how long you keep them, but I would say minimum of 5 years. And that should be in your program guidance for your programs and kind of have an outline of the number of years that you're keeping them for and where they're located as well. Because for a lot of public information requests, they'll have people coming right to your office and asking you to look through those things.
And that's 5 years from the close of the grant, okay? Not from when you get it.
Yes, just add to that.
And just let me repeat that again. That's 5 years from the closing of that grant, okay? You've finished everything out. Yes, sir.
It's actually 5 years from when the state closes their grant.
Oh, pardon me. Did you hear that? It's actually for us. It's 5 years from when the state closes their grant with HUD. And when they're talking about that, they're talking about the big dollars that rolled in under the entire grant. So not just your particular grant, but the whole grant for the state of Texas. That's our retention records on our side. For HUD, yes, ma'am?
And just to follow up with what Josh was saying, the environmental records are part of the complete record for that grant. So in every contract, there will be language about the record retention that is going to be specific to that particular.
There you go.
Make sure that whether it's Harvey, 15, 16, or whatever we get in the future, that you are referencing the record retention requirement in a specific contract.
Perfect.
Can you please repeat that? What you just said?
Okay, she wanted to make sure that you all realize that. And actually, Esmeralda, can I get you to come up and actually say that again so it records? We want to make sure it's recorded. They could hear you, but I want to make sure it's recorded. Because this is actually pretty important. I'm still in those classes.
So what Josh was saying earlier is the specific tie back to the state's contract with the with HUD. I went on to add a little bit more to say that every contract for that specific funding opportunity is going to have its record retention requirements built into the language of the boilerplate. So you want to be sure that the community that you are providing a service for is aware of that, and that the environmental records are part of the overall grant documentation that they are responsible for maintaining as stated in that specific contract. So just be aware of that.
All right, it's 10:05. I'm going to get through the buyout and acquisition here real quick. It's about 4 or 5 slides, and then we're going to take a quick break for this morning. Just wanted to kind of give you a heads up. Okay. All righty, so just very quickly, as we're kind of stepping into the buyout acquisition piece, and I'm going to read straight from the slides. This is actually coming straight from the Federal Register to kind of outline for you, but it's got very good information. So, buyout, as referenced in the Federal Register notice dated February 9th, 2018, refers to acquisition of properties located in a floodway or floodplain that is intended to reduce risk from future flooding or the acquisition of properties in disaster risk reduction areas as designated by the grantee. You're the grantees. Any property acquired, accepted, or from which a structure will be removed pursuant to the project will be dedicated and maintained in perpetuity, and that's very important, in perpetuity for use that is compatible with open space, recreational, or floodplain and wetlands management practices. And further, because we've had a few questions about this, so I wanted to make sure to get this in there. No new structure will be erected on the property acquired, accepted, or from which a structure was removed under the acquisition or relocation programs other than, a couple of things, a public facility that is open on all sides, which makes sense if you're talking about floodplain, floodway, and functionally related to a designed open space, so a park, a campground, or outdoor recreational area, a restroom, or a flood control structure provided that structure does not reduce valley storage, increase erosive velocities, or increase flood heights on the opposite bank, upstream or downstream, and that the local floodplain manager approves in writing before the commencement of the construction of the structure. For anything that you're going to be placing on that property, be it recreational or an outdoor recreation area or whatnot, if you're talking about jogging trails, if you're talking about putting up that bathroom or whatever else to have out there in your park setting, you have got to go to your local floodplain manager, and you need to get approval for whatever that is, including the materials that they're going to be utilizing. If they're putting out a pavilion and they're actually going to put a slab of concrete out there, you need to get approval from him that it's okay, because it's going to go to impervious cover. I mean, the whole point is that we're trying to restore the floodplain. So once you get that approval from them, you need to get that approval in writing. That needs to become part of your record. And we're going to be looking for that, because we're not going to prescribe to you what it is that you can put in there. You've got to go to your local floodplain manager. They've got to approve that. And then they'll send that back to us. And that kind of goes to the communities themselves and their rating system. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in floodplain, but this is something that was very specific to some questions we're already getting on buyout and acquisition. After receipt of the assistance with respect to any property acquired, accepted, or from which a structure was removed under the acquisition or relocation program, no subsequent application for additional disaster assistance for any purpose or to repair damage or make improvements of any sort will be made by the owner of the buyout property, including subsequent owners to any federal entity in perpetuity. So you're designing things that need to be able to withstand what happens. So if you are adding something to that property. The entity acquiring the property may lease it to adjacent property owners or other parties for compatible uses in return for a maintenance agreement. Although federal policy encourages leasing rather than selling such property, the property may also be sold. However, in all cases, a deed restriction, I don't know where the D went away from, a deed restriction or covenant running with the property must require that the buyout property be dedicated and maintained for compatible uses in perpetuity. And that's going to be something that we're going to be very solid on because of what the nature of the program is. This is straight out of your Federal Register. Okay, we're going to drop back into public notices, but we're going to do that after we take a quick break.
Should I mention one thing about
Sure.
buyouts and acquisitions?
She's delaying your break, I'm just saying.
Sorry, it's real quick. So I know from grant management team, we have 58 anticipated buyout and acquisition programs coming in for Harvey. Is that correct, Esmeralda? 58. Anybody in the room in charge or going to be the responsible entity of any of those programs? Can you raise your hand? Okay, great. So that lady standing at the back of the room named Angel is going to be your friend, your point of contact, and for all questions and answers related to buyout and acquisitions. So that's great. And one other thing I wanted to mention that Miriam, one of our grant managers, brought up in a meeting we had about what is considered functionally dependent in a floodway floodplain for buyouts and acquisitions. Because you're taking an area and you're changing it into green space. Within that green space, very likely there's going to be a floodway. So HUD prohibits anything in a floodway, correct? So we asked our HUD representatives, for instance, if you're doing a hike-bike trail that goes through a floodway, we're not adding impervious cover, it's granite rock, would that be considered functionally dependent? Or would we have to build a pedestrian bridge over the part of the park that's a floodway so that people aren't traversing through it? The answer is great, which we all hope for, which is yes, it's functionally dependent. So you can do trails, hike-bike trails through the floodway in a park. There's going to be a lot of different things coming up. For instance, can you put a picnic table in the floodway portion of the park that has a concrete base? Or would that base be considered, changing the ratio of impervious cover? And no, that's going to be allowed as well. So for specific questions like that, Angel will be your person to go to, but generally speaking, hike and bike trails that go through the floodway or adjacent to the floodway in the floodplain will be allowed and will be considered functionally dependent. That was it. The only thing I had to add.
Is there a question?
And even on those picnic tables, again, go to your local floodplain administrator, because it can go to the size of property as to what they may or may not allow. They may ask for a different type that's anchored in a different way. So just kind of a comment there. Always go to that local floodplain manager. All righty. It is 10:12, but the clock says 10:15. How about we take a 10-minute break if you guys will get back at 10:25?